And welcome to our ongoing coverage of the US election 2024, live from Washington, D.C. I'm Melinda Nusofora.
And I'm Adijan Ayandar. You know, Melinda, for the past, I would say 48 hours or so, the media here has been assessing and dissecting the results of these presidential elections. The questions they were asking: what went right for the Republicans? What went wrong for the Democrats? But we want to take a look forward. What a second President Trump presidency will look like in terms of foreign policy.
Indeed, that is the big question that the world is looking at now. So for the next hour, we're going to be crossing to correspondents right across the globe. First of all, we're going to be going to Europe to discuss the foreign policy fallout and the possible implications for NATO, Ukraine and Russia. And of course, we'll be going to our correspondents in the Middle East to talk about what a Trump presidency may look like for the region.
But let's begin with reactions to President Trump's re-election. Neil Giordano begins our coverage this hour.
The guardrails are off.
This was, I believe, the greatest political movement of all time.
In the wake of a crushing victory and stunning political comeback Tuesday, Donald Trump will return to the White House with an ironclad mandate and few legal or political checks on power. Buoyed by a resounding win, Trump is now poised to control both chambers of Congress and execute his America First agenda he has thrice campaigned on. Bracing for a radically transformed political order, world leaders scrambled to congratulate President-elect Trump online. Noticeably absent was a message from Russian President Vladimir Putin. This week, a Russian official described U.S.-Russia relations at a historic low. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov.
Let's not forget that we are talking about an unfriendly country that is directly and indirectly involved in the war against our state.
Ukraine, meanwhile, is anxious that U.S. support may decline and a quick peace deal touted by Trump might favor Russia. With protracted wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, European leaders are no doubt eager to get face time with the president-elect.
But I also look forward to sit down with President Trump and to navigate how collectively we'll make sure that we face this threat and that we keep our part of the world safe.
Trump's threats of a U.S. retraction from its NATO allies is causing measured alarm among longtime allies.
There has been a strategic awakening among us Europeans, and we must embrace it. We cannot delegate our security to the Americans forever.
On the economic front, President-elect Trump's promise to slap tariffs of up to 60% on U.S. imports has brought an air of uncertainty to the global economy, in particular to China. China's foreign ministry wrote, "We respect the choice of the American people and congratulate Mr. Trump on being elected as President of the United States." With Trump's return to the global stage, nonetheless, world leaders are bracing for the next Trump storm. Neil Giordano, TRT World.
We have special guests on set with us here in Washington to break down all these major issues. First of all, joining us is Orson Porter. He is a political strategist. Thanks for being here, Orson.
Absolutely. And we also have Thomas Warwick. He is the director of the Future of the Homeland Security Project over at the Atlantic Council. Gentlemen, welcome to both of you. Thomas, allow me to begin with you. You know, anytime you actually have a change in leadership in the White House, going from Democrat to Republican or Republican to Democrat, you're going to expect some sort of change when it comes to foreign policy.
Oh, yes.
Is that more pronounced when that Republican is Donald Trump?
Yes, because I think what we're likely to see is a return to the instincts that former President Trump showed, especially late in his previous term. I expect we're going to see a number of personality-driven issues. President Trump has his favorite foreign leaders. He has others he's less interested in working with. We've already seen signs in the outreach from some of these foreign leaders to the president-elect to congratulate him. That's actually normal, but in some cases these conversations are already starting to get into issues of substance even before President Trump is sworn in January. So it's going to be a wild ride, no doubt about that. But in some respects I see more continuity in approach rather than continuity in policy.
Also, what do you think? Could we see a change in direction in major foreign policy areas?
I think you will, and I think what's not being discussed, and I 100% agree with what he said, is if he's able to have the Senate under his control, and then probably the next 2 or 3 days we'll get word that the Republicans control the House. And I think that's the triple whammy.
It's a clean sweep
of foreign policy that really has no guardrails on whatever they may decide to do, and may actually expedite anything from an agenda purpose or agenda-wise on his first 100 days or his first day in office, if he has Congress behind him to sign off on just about anything he wants to get done from a foreign policy perspective.
Okay, gentlemen, stay with us. We're going to turn to our US correspondents now for a little bit of analysis on the ground. Let's head to John Brain, who is in West Palm Beach, Florida. John, thanks for joining us. Give us a sense of what you're hearing will be future President or incoming President Donald Trump's major foreign policy priorities.
Well, it's all about America first, isn't it, Melinda? Everything will be done through the prism of what is in the US's best interests. So Trump does not want America to be the world's policeman. There's certainly no question in his mind of the US being dragged into other nations' conflicts militarily or even financially. So clearly further funding for Ukraine looks vulnerable. Trump says he can resolve that war within 24 hours. But it's probably wrong to see him as an isolationist. He's not really an ideologue. He's a transactional politician. He's prepared to do deals when he believes deals can be done. And one notable success of the first Trump administration was the Abraham Accords, when the US negotiated the rapprochement between Israel and some Middle Eastern countries, including the United Arab Emirates. So he may be able to get Netanyahu to do a peace deal, a ceasefire deal in Gaza far more easily than Biden has been able to do that. So there could be some positives in that sense from a Trump administration. And the other factor is he believes his unpredictability can be an asset. He says about China and Iran, they think I'm a little bit crazy. They don't know what I'm going to do. And that, he believes, can actually help the US in the long term, because if they're always guessing what the reaction might be from the US to anything they do, that may restrain them from doing anything that's not in the US's interest. But as I say, it's all going to be about what is the best thing for America, never mind how that might affect the rest of the world if it's in the US's interests.
John Brain, thank you, live there out of Florida.
You know, Melinda, it's still going to be about 2.5 months until President-elect Donald Trump moves into 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. The current president, Joe Biden, spoke for the very first time since the elections. Let's have a listen to what he had to say.
And I assured him that I would direct my entire administration to work with his team to ensure a peaceful and orderly transition. That's what the American people deserve. Yesterday, I also spoke with Vice President Harris. She's been a partner and a public servant. She ran an inspiring campaign, and everyone got to see something that I learned early on to respect so much: her character. She has a backbone like a ramrod. She has great character, true character. She gave her whole heart and effort, and she and her entire team should be proud of the campaign they ran.
All right, let's bring in Selena Downs, who joins us now also from Washington. Selena, when you look at sort of the tone of the incumbent president's first speech after the election, very different when compared to 4 years ago.
Yeah, that's right. A very difficult speech for President Biden to have to make. These two men, Donald Trump and Joe Biden, are bitter rivals, and President Biden is essentially handing over the keys to the man he defeated in 2020. President Biden came in after Donald Trump and, pledged to restore the soul of the nation. Donald Trump will move back into the White House here in January. President Biden saying this time it will be a peaceful transition of power because, of course, we didn't see that in 2020. Donald Trump refused to concede defeat to Joe Biden. He encouraged his supporters to rally in the Capitol. They overran Congress as it was certifying the results, which proved that he had, in fact, lost to President Biden. And a lot of people saw that as a threat to the sort of founding principles of democracy that America is based on. President Biden says this will be a more peaceful transfer of power. He has pledged to work with Donald Trump in the coming weeks. He's invited him to the White House for a visit within weeks. But essentially, President Biden has acknowledged the will of the American people. He has acknowledged defeat. He's acknowledged the result that the American people voted on. There have been a lot of fingers pointed at him because of Kamala Harris's defeat, that extraordinary loss by the Democrats in this election. And a lot of people are suggesting that perhaps President Biden should have stepped down a little earlier, possibly in January, not July. It would have given them a stronger campaign to run over the course of the year. Possibly it might have given them the chance to have a competitive primary and a leadership contest and somebody who might have taken on Donald Trump and contested the election a little better. But you heard in that speech there, President Biden thanked Kamala Harris, said she'd been hardworking and she'd been a hardworking vice president. The trouble is, it was very difficult for her to distance herself from the policies of Joe Biden, the economic policies, policies on Gaza, on immigration, and the kinds of issues that Americans voted on. So a lot of concern now within the White House and within the Democrats that Donald Trump plans to roll back many of the achievements that the Democrats perceive that they have made over the course of this past 4 years. We know they're going to rush through a bill on funding for Ukraine because we know that Donald Trump has been opposed to more funding going to Ukraine in its war on Russia. He wants those funds to be used domestically. So we might see some rushing through of bills for extra funding in that regard, but certainly some concern within the Democrats that a lot of their liberal-leaning social policies have largely been rejected by the American people.
All right, yeah, a lot of difficulty and concern amongst the Democrats, but they have 2 years to regroup and assess what went wrong. That's until the midterms. Selena, thank you very much for that.
Okay, Alijan, let's bring back in our panel of experts to discuss some of those issues that our correspondents have just raised. Orson, let me start with you. We heard our correspondent John Brain, who's in Florida, saying that Trump will approach his foreign policy with a very America first stance, as is his motto. He will look at foreign policy through the lens of what is best for America. How does that fit with Article 5 of NATO, that collective defense? Do you think the relationship between the US and NATO is going to be vastly different under incoming President Donald Trump?
Yes, is the short answer. But it may take some time to get to the conflict point. I think what people underestimate Trump is that he means what he says. And I think he meant what he said when he talked about a reapproach to NATO. But most importantly, his number one goal is what do the millions of people who voted for him want, and that's through the lens of America First policy. And I think that not only will that drive his foreign policy in the White House, it will also drive what he does on the domestic side, et cetera, et cetera. So the answer to your question, yes, I think it'll take a little time to get to the conflict point, but the lens of America First will drive most of all of his policy, not just foreign policy.
Thomas, let me ask you, you said at the beginning of our conversation that a lot of his foreign policy could be personality-driven issues. How does this, what sort of prism does the Ukraine-Russia conflict play within this? I mean, Selena, I was just talking to her just a moment ago. She says the Democrats don't trust Trump at all, or the Republicans, so they might be scrambling to actually get some additional funding into Ukraine before the end of January.
But that's a possibility. But let's start with what does America First really mean to Donald Trump, because I think there's actually a misunderstanding of that. What Trump feels as a businessman who thinks that the United States is put upon by other nations, and that many nations in Europe were, as he would say, free riders. In other words, they were getting the benefit of the U.S. security umbrella and the nuclear umbrella without paying enough for their defense. And to do that, he used a very extreme rhetoric that was certainly undiplomatic and not in anything like what the transatlantic relationship usually is spoken about here in Washington. But it wasn't about leaving NATO. It was about getting European nations to pay more for their own security. Now, some of those countries have stepped up. Poland and the Baltic states, for example, who feel themselves on the front lines against Russian aggression, but not so much Germany or some of the other Western European countries. Trump is going to put the screws to them, and he is going to expect them to pay a lot more for their own defense. Where this comes down to the Ukraine conflict is he wants Europeans to pay more for Ukraine's defense so that the United States doesn't have to. But he's also, having talked so much about the idea of ending the war on day one, I suspect he will be pressuring both Putin in Moscow and Zelensky in Kyiv to come to some kind of an agreement. Everyone expects that will be some kind of ceasefire in place. And then I want to watch what happens, because as we think of Trump as unpredictable, I don't think you can predict what Putin is going to do. If Zelensky agrees to a ceasefire in place and Russia does not, I have no doubt that Donald Trump will unleash Ukrainian weapons to strike anywhere they like inside Russia. This is one where Trump wants to show that he is the dominant player and that he has the ability to order peace to be made. I have no idea if the initiative will succeed, but this is not going to be the initiative a lot of people are thinking it's going to be. It's going to be much more dramatic.
So do you think that when Thomas was saying it was sort of extreme rhetoric and it was undiplomatic, when he takes office at the end of January, he's going to say to Europe, that's not a me problem, that's a you problem, you step up?
Absolutely, and what I mentioned earlier, what is going to be different in the past is that he's going to have both chambers of Congress who control basically the United States Bank to possibly echo his sentiments, which we haven't seen in the past. So, I don't see him backing down in any way. I do think initially there will be some diplomacy, but he meant what he said, and I think because of the mandate that he's received from the popular vote, from the swing of winning all of those battleground states, and most importantly, taking control or keeping the control of Congress and taking control of the Senate, I don't see how that propels him to say slow down.
All right, well, let's put these issues to our correspondents on the ground. We've got coverage in Europe and in Russia. Alex Kadir is with us in Brussels, Joel Flynn in Kyiv, and Dasha Chernyshova is with us in Moscow. But Alex, let's go to you first. We know that EU leaders are meeting in Budapest today to discuss a raft of issues, none the least what the EU's relationship will be with a Trump presidency. Give us a sense of what European leaders are saying there and how they're reacting to their new US partner.
Well, clearly they're trying to predict the unpredictable, to predict a different kind of a relationship with the United States and what that will mean for trade and for foreign policy and defense here in the European Union. They're trying to figure out how much of what Donald Trump says will actually happen. That is a big question. There are two approaches to this. There is congratulating him warmly on his success at the election. We saw NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, you heard from him just a few moments ago, saying it was a big success, and also crediting President Trump for the increase in defense spending for Europe's NATO allies. So a little bit of flattery, a little bit of effort to improve relations as quickly as possible. But on the other hand, you have the preparations. President Macron of France saying the world is divided between herbivores and carnivores. And at the moment, the Europeans are too much like herbivores, and they need to move towards being omnivore, not attacking, not provoking, but being able to defend themselves. That means boosting defense spending. Also, a lot of concerns about trade. The US US is Europe's biggest trading partner in terms of goods. If Donald Trump slaps 10%, 20% tariffs on goods coming from the European Union, that will have a very big impact on the EU's economy. So for the economy, for trade, for security, the European Union is bracing for a very bumpy time indeed.
All right, Alex, thank you very much for that live for us from Brussels. Let's cross over now to the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, and speak to TRT World's Joel Flynn. Joel, good to see you. You know, without a doubt, world leaders were watching the results of these elections very closely, but perhaps none more than Volodymyr Zelensky, who was literally on the edge of his seat. What's been the reaction there?
Well, Zelensky himself has been at this European Political Community Summit in Budapest, and he used this phrase that we'd already seen him use when he was congratulating Donald Trump on his re-election: strength, peace through strength. It is a new phrase. It is something that we hadn't really heard. Certainly it wasn't part of his victory plan necessarily, but it essentially attests to what he believes needs to happen in order for the war to end. Ultimately, Western support needs to continue for Kiev. It needs to continue coming in the numbers, and it needs to translate to the military support that it vitally needs on the ground. The Russians have been making big advances this year. The Ukrainians ultimately aren't able to stop them in the way that they would like. As far as Europe is concerned, there is a lot of concern in Ukraine about what the Europeans are actually able to provide if US financial assistance does dry up, as many suspect it would do under a Trump presidency. But there is a lot of talk, a lot of concern about not just the ability of the Europeans to make up for the shortfall in American funding, but also the willingness of the Europeans to do so. One source has privately told us that he doesn't believe that the Europeans still really understand that this war that the Ukrainians are fighting is ultimately a war that they are fighting on behalf of the rest of Europe. We've heard European leaders talk about a strategic awakening, but here in Ukraine, there is a sense that Europe may be sleepwalking towards an ever more dangerous future.
Joel Flynn, thank you for that out of Kyiv. Let's look at the other side of this conflict and bring in Dasha Chernyshova, who is in Moscow for us. Dasha, in the lead-up, during this campaign, we heard Donald Trump saying he will end this conflict on day one. It'll take him one day, he'll have the whole thing wrapped up. Give us a sense of how Russia, how President Vladimir Putin is reacting to the re-election of Donald Trump.
Well, first of all, you have to keep in mind Russia has been showing some sort of constrained optimism, very cautious optimism with regards to the outcome of the U.S. election, saying that they don't believe here in Moscow that there could be any change in the U.S. general line towards Russia, as well as the conflict in Ukraine, saying that there is the bipartisan consensus in the United States, which is deeply anti-Russian. So now we have the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov saying once again that Moscow is willing to cooperate and to establish dialogue and contacts with any administration that will be taking the office. Now, it is obvious it is the administration of Donald Trump, and with regard to that, Moscow is saying that it is quite optimistic and quite exaggerated to say that this conflict in Ukraine could be over in just one day. So Moscow doesn't really believe that, but at the same time, they are saying that they are waiting for the inauguration next January to see how the administration of Donald Trump will be acting and what will be not the campaign slogans, but the real steps on the ground. We also understand from Moscow that if the new U.S. administration is seeking peace instead of seeking to continue the conflict, that will be definitely better than the previous one. And also interesting comments have been made with regard to the possibility of any contact between the Russian President Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. We understand from the Kremlin that it does not rule out the possibility of such a conversation taking place ahead of the inauguration of Donald Trump next year. We also understand from the Kremlin that there is no work underway when it comes to the possibility of a face-to-face meeting, but certainly many would be saying that would be a breakthrough. And also the Kremlin has confirmed that there is no plan for the Russian president to hold any contact with outgoing Joe Biden.
All right, Dasha Chernyshova live for us from the Russian capital, Moscow. Thank you very much for that. You know, when you look at sort of the results of the elections, you cannot overlook the fact that Donald Trump's campaign made huge gains amongst particular demographics and ethnic groups, including Arab Americans. Simply put, they refuse to vote for Kamala Harris and the Democrats because of what's going on with Israel's war on both Gaza and Lebanon. Andy Rosen has this story for us from Michigan.
At this Arab Americans for Trump election night watch party, they erupted in cheers at Donald Trump's win. This would have been unthinkable in Trump's last two elections. Michigan's Arab population, the largest in the nation, had thoroughly rejected Trump. This time, he earned about 43% of Michigan's Arab voters, compared to about 38% for Kamala Harris. And voters told us why.
Because he's good for America, bro.
Those who say, well, he has said some things and done some things that could be perceived as anti-Muslim. Does that resonate with you? Did that give you any doubts at all?
No, it's fine, buddy, like that. It's fine. I like the guys. I think you're doing better here. His life is too hard right now. It's good for business, for economy, for everything, bro.
I just want this world to go back to the way it was 4 years ago. It's just way too chaotic right now and crazy.
Last question. There are those who say that Jill Stein is more pro-Palestinian.
I know, but trust me, if there was any chance that she could win, I would vote for her. But you got to go with the facts, you know?
The Arab Americans been suffering because Biden has policy over the Middle East.
Democrats tried, but could not get voters to look past a year's worth of frustration at the Biden-Harris administration. And after Trump's visit to this community a few days ago, Harris never came here. They liked his very simplistic view of the wars.
You're going to have peace in the Middle East, and they should have peace in the Middle East.
But you had to fight that uphill battle of people saying, well, Trump has said and done things as president that were seen as anti-Muslim. Was that difficult to overcome, that perception?
Well, I mean, it was very difficult at the personal level. And I have put faith in the fact that he will stand for peace, he will end the wars, and I would not be surprised if President Trump picks up the phone tomorrow and calls Netanyahu and tells him to stop it.
As for the independent candidate Jill Stein, she got 18% of Michigan's Arab vote, which means she got more votes than Trump's margin of victory over Harris, which means she probably cost Harris the Arab vote in this state and probably cost her the whole state. Andy Rosen, TRT World, Dearborn, Michigan.
All right, let's bring the conversation back to our guests now, Orson and Thomas. When you look at sort of the margin of victory that President-elect Trump had, yes, especially in the blue states, the Rust Belt states, Wisconsin about 3 points, Pennsylvania about 2 points, but nearly twice that much, 2.5 times that much in Michigan, obviously. Did the Democrats really underestimate the message here?
Yes, I think the Democrats got away from the most important issue. I'm from the great state of Wisconsin, and know firsthand from visiting my parents and friends and relatives that the only thing anyone wanted to talk about when I went home was how much things were in the grocery store, economic issues, kitchen table issues. So I think, you know, the Democrats kind of strayed away from that economic kitchen table policy issue first and started talking about Trump more than they were about the economy. And I think that kind of lost some folks, particularly in the Midwest, and you saw a lot of people who are in the labor community or middle class folks begin to think that maybe Democrats weren't listening to the #1 issue. You know, yes, immigration is important, but the thing that people cared most about is the economy. You know, how much am I bringing home, and how am I going to provide for my family? I think if we would have spent a little bit more time and been laser focused on that the last 2 weeks, you might have seen different results, but he ran the table. And every angle that you look at, you know, my old political advisor used to say that politics at the end of the day is about addition, not subtraction. Trump added. Democrats subtracted from the base that they thought they had, and unfortunately it was a bad day.
If we look at the way that the Muslim vote moved away from the Democrats, saying that they couldn't support the Democrats after the policies they'd seen in the past year in the Middle East. Thomas, I'm curious as to what you think a Trump presidency may look like for Palestinians in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. I mean,
yes.
He moved the embassy to Jerusalem during his last presidency. How can they think that this is going to be better?
Well, there's a term, buyer's remorse, that says that when you buy something and it doesn't work out, you are doubly disappointed by the fact that you thought you got a good deal and you didn't. And that may be what happens to some people in Michigan after this. It's already seemed clear that Prime Minister Netanyahu feels emboldened. He dismissed the defense minister, who was a close friend of many in Washington and worked closely with the Biden administration. It looks now as though the check on Israel doing even more of what Netanyahu wants to do is going to be the leaders of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. One of the things that struck me was, even in his victory, President-elect Trump made it very clear he wants to renew the Abraham Accords and expand it to other countries. He can't do that without Saudi Arabia. But this actually now gives the King of Saudi Arabia and Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed in the United Arab Emirates enormous influence to try to shape how a Trump administration approaches the war in Israel with Hamas and Hezbollah.
All right, well, while we're talking about the Middle East, let's head there and speak to our correspondents. We have Priyanka Navani standing by for us in Lebanon. But first of all, let's turn to Mohammed Al-Qassem in occupied East Jerusalem. Mohammed, thanks for being with us here on this election special. Give us a sense of what Palestinians are thinking and feeling about the prospect of a Trump presidency. Do they believe that this could end the war, or do they feel like things could get worse?
Well, it's not even what they think about extending the war. What they're thinking about also, they're extremely worried and dismayed about what other steps President-elect Donald Trump will be taken regarding the Palestinian cause. They hear that he wants to end all wars in the Middle East, and especially Israel's war in Gaza. But they're wondering what's the mechanism, what kind of measures he will be taken to impose or exert pressure on Israel to end the war in Gaza. Is it going to come on the account of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, as well as in the occupied West Bank and occupied East Jerusalem? So they're still unsure, but they are also worried about the steps that he may take afterward. They've experienced Trump in the past. 4 years of Trump in 2016 until 2020 that really, in the minds of Palestinians, brought major harm to the Palestinian cause, recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, moving the embassy, the American embassy, to Jerusalem, eliminating funds to UNRWA, which Israel a week ago with legislation passed in its parliament, basically banning UNRWA's work in the occupied territories, also shutting down the Palestine Liberation Organization offices in Washington, and many other steps. The Palestinian Authority is worried that it will be marginalized when Trump takes office, that the Trump administration will try to revive again the so-called deal of the century, which basically aims at annexing big portion of the occupied West Bank, of giving sovereignty over illegal settlements in the occupied West Bank to Israel. So there are so many questions that the Palestinians are worried about. They don't have any clear path forward, any plans, any idea in what direction President-elect Trump is going to go. They hear good news, good signs that he wants to end the war, but they don't know how he wants to end these wars. And that's why these are problematic statements. And they are also concerned that maybe Trump yet again will try to marginalize the Palestinians, set aside their cause, try to appease the far-right elements within this far-right coalition government led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on the account of the Palestinians all over the occupied territories, including Gaza. This is not good news for the Palestinians, said one advisor to Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas. He said, we congratulated him. We want to start on positive note with the incoming U.S. administration. But again, and I'm quoting this advisor to President Abbas, deep inside, we know there is more trouble coming. End of quote. Back to you.
Yeah. Some Palestinian leaders are understandably very nervous. So that's the outlook on Gaza as well as the occupied West Bank. Mohammed Al-Qasim, thank you very much, live for us from occupied East Jerusalem. Let's cross now over to the Lebanese capital, Beirut, and bring in our Priyanka Navani. Priyanka, you know, when you turn back the clock about a week or so, there was a bit of, I'm going to say, cautious optimism when it came to the prospect of a ceasefire. Where do those feelings stand now that we're after the election?
Sure, Ali John, just to dissect that a little bit, it was cautious because we had the arrival of U.S. Special Envoy Amos Hochstein here in Beirut about 3 weeks ago. And it was said by Lebanese officials at that time that if there was no progress on the ceasefire then there was not going to be a ceasefire until after the American election. And indeed, at that time, there was no progress. But then last week, there seemed to have been this sort of last-ditch effort by the Biden administration to get something going. And we saw the arrival of 2 U.S. envoys in Tel Aviv last week. But then they did not come to Beirut, which is what they would ordinarily do. And we also saw the resumption of strikes on Beirut's southern suburbs, essentially the next day after these envoys left Tel Aviv. And that is something that Washington has told the Israelis that they do not want to see. So the combination of both of those two things was what led the Lebanese Prime Minister to say at that time that the Israelis are indeed not serious about a ceasefire. So then we get to essentially 2 days ago, we now have the election of former President Trump. He's going to be back in office. And I would say that the resounding sentiment now among Lebanese is just that in the next 2.5 months until Trump takes office, we are not only not going to see a ceasefire, but we could be looking at a further escalation. And that is because a lot of the Lebanese people believe that the Israelis are not going to feel that they are going to have to answer to an outgoing administration. And actually, we have seen this illustrated on the ground just in the last 48 hours. We have seen material damage on Lebanon's only international airport for the first time since fighting broke out on October 8th, 2023. And we are really seeing attacks now on every major population center in Lebanon. It's not just about the Beirut southern suburbs, which obviously it's always been the most populated city, but particularly now with all of the displaced people, we have 1.5 million people displaced in Lebanon. We have almost double the population now living in Beirut. But it's not just Beirut. It is Beirut, it is Sidon, it is Baalbek, it is Nabatea, it is every, again, major population center in Lebanon. Excuse me. So that is how Lebanese are feeling really about the next 2.5 months. But when Donald Trump gets into office, I think Lebanese are really of two minds. There are the people that really disagree with what Trump did under his first term, in that he brokered the Abraham Accord, something a lot of people in Lebanon do not believe that the Arab countries should be doing without the formation of a Palestinian state. So they did not they were not particularly pleased with Trump's role in that. Obviously, of course, there's also the move of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. That is not something that a lot of people here in Lebanon wanted to see. However, there is also this sentiment, which I think is shared by a lot of Arab communities in America, which is that perhaps Trump is going to be this deal broker. Perhaps he is going to be able to do something that the Biden administration was not going to be able to do, and that, the situation in Lebanon really couldn't get any worse. So maybe just having a new president is going to help them in some way. As your guest just mentioned, there's also this idea that Trump wants to expand the Abraham Accords. If the Abraham Accords expansion is going to include Saudi Arabia, and we know that Saudi Arabia is not going to sign that without the formation of a Palestinian state, well, that could be something that the Lebanese people also want to see. They want to see that formation of a Palestinian state. Remember that Lebanon is also home to about 500,000 Palestinian refugees. They have been here for decades. So I think there are many different feelings about the election of Donald Trump to office, but the resounding sentiment right now in Lebanon is just that this is going to be a rough couple of months, and we are not going to see a ceasefire anytime until Trump is in office.
A difficult 2 months indeed. Priyanka Navani, thank you for bringing us the latest there out of Beirut. Alajan, we can't talk about this regional conflict, foreign policy, without talking about Iran. So we have another special guest on our panel of experts. Let's welcome Trita Parsi. Thanks for being here. Trita is the Executive Vice President of the Foreign Policy think tank, the Quincy Institute, and also, interestingly, for the discussion we're about to launch into, the former president of the National Iranian-American Council. So, Trita, let's talk US and Iran under incoming President Donald Trump. On Wednesday, Iran's currency hit an all-time low, and we're hearing people across the country are bracing for a very difficult and challenging 4 years ahead. What do you predict will come of the Iran-US relationship under Donald Trump?
So what's fascinating when it comes to what Trump may or may not do, and what Harris probably would have done, is that the spectrum of outcomes are far wider now. We may very well end up seeing Trump going exactly back to what he did before: maximum pressure, sanctions, confrontation, and potentially even war. But we may also see him actually strike a deal. He's been talking about it. He's been making it very clear that his only red line is no nuclear weapons, but other than that, he's not interested in regime change. He's not talking about other issues in the region that is of importance to some Arab allies of the United States when it comes to Iran's influence throughout the region. Whereas with Kamala Harris, as much as I think she would desire it, I don't see her, or the Biden administration for that matter, actually being willing to pay the political cost at home to actually revive Barack Obama's nuclear deal. And just take a look at what Biden didn't do on Cuba as well. I mean, these are two major foreign policy legacies that Obama had that essentially went to die under Biden. Trump tried to kill them, but it's the Biden administration's failure to revive them that actually ended up killing them. So given her lack of experience in foreign policy, first-time president, taking on negotiations with Iran is a massive undertaking. Obama only managed to do it in his second term when he was in a safer position, and still had to pay a massive political cost. So as a result, it may not go all the way towards war under Kamala Harris, but it would also likely not have gone towards any type of resolution. Whereas with Trump, both opportunities are likely. The least likely one is status quo.
Trita, let me ask you, I mean, all right, I understand it's essentially a coin flip. There's two options on the table here, and we're going to have to wait and see in terms of which one he chooses. But in terms of the leadership in Tehran, keep in mind that Donald Trump was the person who actually ordered the strike that killed Qasem Soleimani, and that was essentially sort of an event that sort of tipped the scales. When you're looking at the groups in the region, the proxy groups that's supported by Tehran, not only Hamas, but also Hezbollah, but also the Houthis in Yemen, what type of message is Tehran giving to these groups?
Well, the message they have given to these groups, and I wouldn't agree with the terminology of proxy group. I mean, some of them are obviously very, very close to Tehran, but the Houthis are very independent. And Hamas's relationship with Iran is nowhere near the relationship it has with Hezbollah. But the message, interestingly enough, that Tehran had been giving these groups from day one after October 7th was restraint and pull things back. And we saw that even at the time in which Houthi leaders publicly complained and said, had it not been for Iran, Houthis would have done more. At one point, they put pressure on the Iraqi militias to stop attacking American bases. And the Iraqi militias issued a statement publicly saying that we're only doing it grudgingly because the Iranians are putting pressure on them. At this point, however, we're at a point in which we may end up seeing a major confrontation between Iran and Israel. And under those circumstances, if it leads to a full-scale war where the U.S. is being quite involved in it, and when we see the U.S. has now moved the THAAD missile systems to Israel, and that means that we have U.S. troops in Israel that may actually get killed in this confrontation, we're much closer to a point in which there will be no restraint from Iran on its own military, but also no restraint from Tehran being signaled to some of these different groups.
Let's open the Iran question to our other guests as well. Thomas or Orson, do you want to weigh in on what you think Trump's relationship with Iran may look like?
Well, I think we can stop talking about all-out war. I mean, no one's talking about ground troops invading anybody. What we're likely to see, though, are strikes like we have seen in the past. Israel trying to strike Iran's military facilities. The key question for many of us is, will Iran see a Trump election as a reason to restrain its nuclear program or to break out and try to actually build a nuclear weapon? If they went down the latter road, I see no other outcome besides a massive military strike on Iranian targets that would include air defenses, missile sites, nuclear facilities, and may even involve the United States. But Iran could signal restraint, that it would not go down that road and forestall a massive Israeli military attack. Let's obviously hope that's the course that the leaders in Tehran choose to follow.
Orson?
I'd just go back to what I said earlier about the Congress. Keep a careful eye on not just funding, but how this discussion in the chambers of Congress is going to change, particularly in the Senate, that will kind of dictate where Trump may go. But more importantly, I think over the next 2 weeks, you'll see Trump make his cabinet pick selections, and the individuals that he puts in those positions will give us a lot of preview of where he may go on these policy issues.
Since we're talking about sort of potential cabinet picks, it was, for lack of a better way of putting it, I'd say even the Trump administration, the first time around in 2016, is going to admit that it didn't go very smoothly. Some disastrous picks, in some key important positions. Do you feel that they have the experience now to say, all right, we need to be making better positions, people that are going to stick around with us for 4 years and sort of implement our vision?
No one who serves in the Trump administration expects to serve 4 years. That's just not the way it works. I think we're likely to see some familiar faces. Mike Pompeo may come back. He was the author of or delivered the famous speech in May of 2008 that laid out the vision for what Iran needed to do to improve relations, and that did not go down well in Tehran. So we're also likely to see some new faces or people who had behind-the-scenes roles, like Rick Grenell, perhaps as National Security Advisor. These people are likely to take a very tough line on Iran, and I think we're going to see some hard decisions having to be made in Tehran as they decide how they're going to accommodate a Trump presidency. I really am one of these people who follows the value of the rial against the dollar as the measure for what's going on. And I think what you mentioned earlier, Melinda, about the collapse of the rial against the dollar tells you everything you need to know about the people's concerns there over what their future might bring, unless the government in Tehran changes its policy to accommodate what Trump is trying to tell them not to do.
It looked like you wanted to weigh in on something Thomas was saying.
When it comes to the personnel issue, I agree fully. I mean, that's going to be absolutely decisive. One of the things that has happened, though, and we could see that with the pick of J.D. Vance. Look at what Don Jr. said at the RNC speech in regards to J.D. Vance. He said that this is a major blow to the neocons. There are elements in the Trump circle that feel very strongly that part of the problem they had last time around is that they had neocons, such as Mike Pompeo, in the cabinet, such as John Bolton in the inner circle, and that created massive problems for the agenda Trump had when it came to pulling out of Syria and things of that nature. So I think there's going to be a much bigger fight this time around that line. Do people like that get in or not? Whereas last time, that was not as prominent of an issue because it wasn't as clear to many of the Trump people exactly what a Pompeo would do if he were to come in.
Yeah, I wouldn't characterize Mike Pompeo as a neocon. That's far too simplistic. But I do think you're likely to see figures who will ensure American military dominance. And then I think you're going to see Trump. One thing that needs to be taken seriously, he really does not want to be a war president. But he's also willing to be unpredictable. And as you said, Alijan, in the Qasem Soleimani strike, he's willing to deliver a forceful blow when he thinks that suits his interest. I have no doubt that approach towards Tehran is going to continue. And an important thing to understand is he expects Tehran's leaders to accommodate his position. He does not intend to change his approach to accommodate their position.
But when we're talking about sort of Mike Pompeo's previous measures and not going well in Tehran, keep in mind that there's a new administration in Tehran right now. We actually have elements, especially the vice president right now, a former foreign minister that served 2 administrations ago. Do you feel that that's going to sort of make any difference at all?
It certainly will, or certainly they had planned to. When they were in New York back in September, the signal they were sending was very clear. Not only did they want diplomacy, they were signaling that their position on Ukraine and Russia was also something that could be amended. They signaled that they're not just looking to go back to the JCPOA, they deviated from that position which they had insisted on for years, that there had to be some different type of a deal. It could be based on the JCPOA, but it wouldn't be identical. Those are very significant, substantive shifts that they had made. I think, though, in the hope that they would strike a deal with Biden during the interim period between Biden and Kamala Harris's presidency. I'm not so sure as how extensive their plans were when it came to Trump. They dealt with Trump, however, and their problem with Trump was not an unwillingness on Trump's end to make a deal. There are a lot that has not been reported of things that happened during that period. Their problem was Mike Pompeo and others in Trump's circle that sabotaged those efforts, even when Trump himself actually wanted it. So I don't think they have a plan on how to circumvent that. It all, again, comes down to who Trump decides to put into his cabinet.
We've only got a few minutes left, so let's just do a very brief final words from each of you on Trump and foreign policy. Austin, first to you.
I was just going to add, I think that the number one thing this transition team will be doing is the filter of loyalty. They won't be guessing cabinet picks of whether or not they know the policy. I think the first question at the transition office is how loyal is this person, and that will dictate the selection process, and you saw that through his nomination or his selection of the VP. So the loyalty filter is a priority for these guys, and I think it'll be at the forefront of how they make their selections.
That's interesting. Yeah,
well, and let's also keep everything we've discussed in context. These are not the most important issues that the Trump administration is going to deal with. They have got to deliver on the economy, and yet a number of their initiatives look to increase U.S. inflation and increase the deficit. They have got to, well, they're going to start a policy of mass deportations. This is going to be very divisive in about a year. So everything we've talked about has to be put in context. It may be important to us, and it is very important to the world. It's actually less important to Donald Trump.
Final word from you.
I think one of the interesting things to look out for is to see where does the Democratic Party position itself on foreign policy. During this campaign, Trump said, I want to end the killing. I want to see an end to the killing, which is a beauty pageant type of an answer that should be as unobjectionable as possible. Yet Kamala Harris could not make herself say that. Instead, she said, I want to have the most lethal military force in the world. Yeah. This is a complete switch between where the Republican Party was before and where the Democratic Party used to be. And the question is the Democratic Party going to drift into becoming the party of Liz Cheney?
I mean, I want to sort of echo what Thomas said. I mean, yes, for the domestic electorate, it's about the economy, it's about immigration. but for our purposes, we need to be looking at sort of foreign policy. And from the conversation that we've had with Orson Thomas and Teacher as well, nothing is for sure. Certainly interesting days, especially for journalists like us.
Absolutely. One thing we know about a Trump presidency, the only certainty is uncertainty. It's going to be an interesting 4 years, not just for journalists like us, but for international diplomats right around the world.
We're winding down with our special coverage of the U.S. elections from Washington. From a sunny Washington, you're going to be heading down to a sunny Rio in a couple of days to actually follow the G20.
Absolutely. G20 coming up. We'll see what the world leaders have to say about a Trump presidency down there. Thank you for your company here on TRT World. Do stay with us. Headlines are coming up next.